In China, during the feudal era, women in seclusion developed a secret language called Nushu. The documentary Hidden Letters profiles two women keeping Nushu alive. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. I interviewed the director of Hidden Letters, Violet Du Feng. She grew up in Shanghai and moved to the U.S. as a graduate student to study journalism. She's dedicated herself to telling stories about China for audiences there and abroad. She served as a producer on several projects, including the historical documentary Nanking and the observational portrait Please Remember Me, about an elderly Chinese couple coping with Alzheimer's. That film had a theatrical release in China and led to positive changes in how Alzheimer's is treated. For Hidden Letters, Violet wanted to explore the secret language of Nushu through the eyes of two contemporary women who study the script. One woman, Hu Sheng, lives in Jiangyang, the rural county where Nushu got started. The second woman is the artist Simu, representing the urban experience in Shanghai. The film is beautifully photographed and multi-layered. Violet is keenly interested in how China's embrace of capitalism has affected all aspects of society, including new pressures on women. Nushu's revival is partly motivated by people seeking to make a profit by branding the ancient script onto merchandise. Hidden Letters is on the Oscar shortlist of 15 documentaries that will be narrowed down to 5 nominees later this month. I reached Violet at her home in New York and started by asking how she learned about Nushu.
So I learned about Nushu about 17 years ago when I read the book by Lisa C. Of a very popular novel called Snowflower and the Secret Fan. And it's a fiction novel based on Nushu. And I remember reading it 17 years ago, and which gave me goosebumps because as a Chinese woman, we all knew that, in our history, in our literature, there's little records of women because, women only of elite classes can have access to education. So to have such a language as part of our history that women created and only for us to share women's experiences from feudal society, especially the lower income community, I was so fascinated by it, and I also felt ashamed that it's not something that I grew up learning, and it should be part of my history as a Chinese woman. And I also know that the surprise that I had of discovering this language is largely shared with, most of the Chinese population, because this is something that most of the Chinese don't even know about. But fast forward 17 years, I received, I think 10 years later, I received a call from my two producers, Meta Chamantikas and Jing Chen. And I didn't realize it was around the same time, like 17 years ago, when I was reading the book, that Meta and her mother, her mother is Chinese, and Meta is half Chinese and half Norwegian. They were reading the same book, and her mother from Shanghai, living in Norway, has been pushing her to make a film about Nushu. So she actually has been thinking about it, and in the end reached out to Jane and said that who should we work with and make a film about Nushu. So both of them came to me, and I'm like, wow, I'm so fascinated by this, and I already know about this, and I'm very interested. But if we wanted to make a history film, that's not what I want to do. If there's a way I can tie that with women's experiences in contemporary China, that's a film I want to make, because that was around the time that I was living in China and I got married and became a young mother. And all of a sudden, I started to feel all these gender suppressions and pressures as a woman that I didn't think I would experience before. So because of all that, I think I was really interested to finding a way of tying Nushu as a lens to look at intergenerational women's experiences in China, particularly today.
Can you elaborate on some of your own experiences, what the pressures you were feeling?
Yeah, I moved back to China in 2010, and that was the time that I got engaged and I married my husband. Both of us had education in the U.S., but I think all of a sudden the first thing I experienced, I think, is the vast gender income gap that's happening in China. And that was not something that's familiar to me when I grew up, because under more communist time, when I was brought up, um, I was more brought up by my dad in a way that, it was, in a way, there's no gender income gap. So, my dad and mom made exactly the same money, and my mom was a nurse, and so she took great pride in her work, and she's like Simu's mom in the film, that she's the first generation medical staff in the family. So, and my dad was the one who spent much more time with me in educating me and raising me up, and always telling me that my dream has no limit. I can dream as high as I can dream even higher than boys. And that's how I grew up with. And I never thought that gender can have a ceiling for me in that kind of regard. But with the gender income gap, I start to realize not only just me, but many of my girlfriends are forced to go back to their families to, kind of fulfill more domestic duties and childcare and all that. And another really interesting thing that I noticed is when I grew up, we had the state-provided free childcare system. I was in childcare at 56 days old because my mom had 55 days for her maternity leave, right? And because, the childcare that was provided by my mom's hospital freed her up to work, right after that. So, and we had all of that taken away when I had my daughter. So because of that, there's also like almost no preschools before 3 years old for my daughter. And I realized a lot of the women had to go back to, be full-time moms, including myself. And I start to feel there's some injustice there. And also, that was also during a time when China is transitioning from one-child policy now to encouraging women to have 3 kids because of a population negative growth. And I think along with that, because, the country has been through a vast, rapid economic growth, and then there's a lot of like imbalances created because, the fast speed of economic growth. I realized one of that is also gender imbalances in such a way that things become a lot more capitalistic, right? And I think the government also realized that in a way that they're trying to revive the what's so-called Chinese identity. What is our cultural identity? What is, how do we define as a Chinese? And part of it is reviving the legacy of our traditional culture and all of that. And amidst of that, there is a revival of traditional virtues of women as well, which is really fascinating to me, and also like confuse me in a lot of ways that in a way it kind of like make us more to fulfill the expectations of traditional roles of what women are compared to before. So all of this give me a sense of confusion, and I wanted to find a way to address it. But as you know, like in China, gender inequality is not something you can publicly talk about, and feminism is a bad word, and even today by most people. And I think that I was desperately hoping to find a space to talk about this. But I know that to make a film about women's rights on the nose is never going to be seen in China. So how can I find a tool to talk about it, but without offending, people, and then still find a way to be seen in China? And I think that comes with my experience of producing films about China for the past 20 years, because I firmly believe that to tell a story about China, it's really, really important that we not only not feeding into the Western stereotype of what people look at China, but also we're not feeding into the propaganda stereotype of what, we should say. So how do we navigate in between to find a middle ground so that our films can be seen both in China and elsewhere? Because I think it's absolutely important for films to be seen in China because these are the people who can hold us accountable as filmmakers and hold us accountable of our perspectives. And also, these are the people who can help us move the needle to help the society to become better. So thinking of all that, I think Nushu get me so excited because, creatively, it can get me so many possibilities and opportunities to make a film about this. But also, it's also such a subtle tool that I can talk about a lot of layers that you actually saw in the film.
So in order to tell that story, you focus on two women. One of the women is named Hu Sheng. She lives in the rural area, more rural than Shanghai. And she's recently divorced from an abusive marriage. Uh, and she has a really deep knowledge of Nushu. Um, so she has all these strengths to her, and she's mastered this ancient language, and she's navigating a world where men still seem to be in charge. But that she also has this vulnerable side, in that she has this expertise in something that most people don't understand. She feels some of the confusion that a divorced person can feel about where they're going in their life. Can you describe what drew you to her?
Yes. So I knew that, with the development together with my producers, Jing Chen and Meta, that we know that we wanted to cast the millennial generation. And we were also very clear that we wanted to cast both, women from the rural areas and from the urban settings, because their challenges in gender pressures are quite different, but same around the same time. For me, what brought me to Hu Xin is her sincerity and her honesty. And I think that's absolutely the most important thing, because Yu Shu provides such a space for women to be honest, to be their true self. And I need to make sure that both of my characters can be true in the space when we're making this film. But what particularly made me feel that that's a moment that I know that Hu Xin is going to be my main character is because after the first scouting trip, I had a long conversation with her during the interview, and I know that Yu Shu is what gets her to where she is now. Otherwise, she would be a farmer, and as she said in the film, so Yu Shu give her a lot of accomplishment and also give her a lot of tools to see the world. Other than just being confined in this little village, but what draws me is towards the end, she said that she was very concerned about nobody's going to take over her work because there's no younger generation that will taking Nushu over her, because she's very worried that one day she's going to have a son, she has to take care of her son, and who's going to take care of Nushu. And I remember thinking like, why would that be a conflict, but I didn't really press her for an answer, but I kind of knew there's something there. So, and she said that her husband has been really want her to deliver a son for her. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And this is also still very common in rural areas about what son represents. So a couple of months later, I called her and I said, I want to come back and I want to talk to your husband. And she started crying. And she said 3 days ago, he divorced me. And I said, there, I'm coming to you. So from that point, and then, when I got to her, we had hours of conversations about her marriage and her personal life. And I knew that that was the point that I want to follow her through, because from that point on, she is going to have a different relationship with Nushu, whatever that is. But that's a moment that I know that she will need Nushu in a different way. So, and I wanted to, be with her on that journey.
So the other woman in the film, Simu, lives in Shanghai. She's an artist who uses Nushu in her work. When we meet her, she's engaged to a man who at first appears supportive of her work, but as we watch in the film and the engagement goes on, it seems like his expectations of marriage in a wife's role might be different than hers. Did you see that coming when you first started filming?
No. Not at all. I think that what interests me is that knowing that Hu Xin is getting out of a relationship, that she is getting into a relationship in a marriage. And I think that that would be very important for me to follow her through. But, I didn't know that this is not going to work out at the beginning when we started to follow her journey. But I was thinking that, if they get married, she is going to experience all these pressures that I am experiencing. So even that, I was looking forward to see how she navigated that. But the other thing is, after we start to know the fiance, that, I wanted to make sure that he is actually represents so many men, particularly in Asian countries. Like he's not a bad person, but his expectations for a woman and for himself is also really all confined by these gender, confinement in itself. So we wanted to kind of like have him to be in that role to, like connect to even the men's side of how people see, people like him, like who are actually trapped in his own role as well.
I wonder how you navigate these situations as a filmmaker. The people that you're filming are going through tough situations. You're spending a lot of time with them. They be natural for them to look to you for emotional support, or your role as a filmmaker covering their work could potentially have a different transformative effect on their lives. I wonder how you handle those things.
I think, to be honest, I think as a documentary filmmakers, we can never promise anything because there are so many things that's out of our control, especially in the distribution side. But what I think is what I can control is always checking myself of my consciousness, always checking myself of my integrity here. And that's what I think what we gain the trust from our characters as well, because, like I think the releases doesn't mean anything. When you have the trust, your subjects give you everything. And there are so many things from actually both characters that they're just so open to us. But I think it's important for us to check in ourselves when every step of the way, especially in editing, about what gets into film. And, like what gets in the film that serves, is it just the film or what does it serve? Or does it serve me or what does it serve? So I think that, for example, there are a lot of things that, happened with Simu and her fiance after that episode of the visit to the hometown, and then there's a lot of drama happened there. And then there's a lot of conversations about, whose fault is what. And I like at the end, we were like, this is too trivial to be included in a film that just like point out to that single person. But what we're trying to hope for audience to really see is not to see who is the antagonist, who's the protagonist, but really who they represent. So with that guideline, I hope that with what we have in the film is not to, to make a character black and white, but really to give a sense of, why he or she will be like this, and then get, empathy from audience. And, and then I think what guided us is that, when we look at the footage, we're also looking at the footage with empathy. And when we look at, when we film on set, we're also filming with empathy. So I think that's what can guide us. But honestly, I keep asking myself every day, even today, that, what else we can do to help with the characters, to make sure that, because they have no idea what the distribution and the consequence is going to affect their lives. And, we have conversations with them, but again, we can't predict, right? So, yeah, I think it's an ongoing kind of conversation and an ongoing learning lesson for me as a filmmaker. And I have to be honest. And I don't know that if I have made all the right choices, but all I can say is that, my intention is on the integrity side, and that's what I can hold on to.
So another thing that we observe in the film is different efforts to commercialize Nushu. Even though it's almost a dead language, there are business people who see opportunities to use the script as almost like a brand on clothing and cell phones and to sell Kentucky Fried Chicken. I wonder what you made of this phenomenon.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, what I think is important to anchor this film are, at least there are two folds. One is, how these women internalize the gender perceptions and gender, expectations on them, and what do they want to do with themselves in terms of young women of who they want to be, and how does the legacy of Nushu affect it and transform them in that kind of process. So the internalization of their growth, of their transformation is really, really important. But I also know that it is super important to provide a bigger context of where women are in our society and where women are in the eyes of men today. And I wanted to kind of expand that from these two women. And how do we do that again without stepping on toes and then offend people and do too much on the nose. And I was so grateful that Nushu not only provide us a way to look at the true spirit of sisterhood, but also it can be kind of like a tool to look into this bigger landscape. Because in these commercialization scenes that we show, what I find it most interesting is that men's reaction to Nushu, however they interpret Nushu, which is completely different from its original content, and however they reacted to the practitioners who's in Nushu, the way they reacted to Nushu is how they reacted to women, how they see women. And that's what I think is fascinating and interesting for me to turn my camera particularly to them in these scenes. And I think also the other thing, the parallel of capitalism, of how that created imbalances in gender equality, but at the same time, how that even is taking away the last product that women created intentionally to avoid authority, avoid men, is being taken over a lot of times by men as well. So there's this, ironic parallel in that, but there's also the deeper kind of thing I wanted to reveal about where the gap of gender understanding is between men and women, if that makes sense.
Well, it does seem wild watching the film that this language created for women's empowerment, the museum that's created around it is I understand is run by a man. You see men who are coming to the museum who there's a scene where a man is kind of flirting with one of the women who is flirting may be too generous a word with one of the women who are there doing Nushu demonstrations. There seems to be a lack of wherewithal of many of the men who are engaging with Nushu, that it's a that it's a language that represents a woman's shared space.
Absolutely. And again, think about it. The reason that you feel appalled by it is because we have a camera there. But this is actually everyday women's experiences are in China. The potato scene conversation of, men's presence in these conversations about what they should do with Nushu as a team, and how women has to be politely, elegantly respond to that, but also firmly show our objection. This is our everyday life. And I wanted to show that to make both sides to see where we are still today in a larger society.
I want to ask you about your own evolution as a filmmaker. I heard an interview with you where you described a memory from childhood that growing up in Shanghai, your family had a rare television set in your neighborhood, and one time they brought it out to the alley so the neighborhood could watch a documentary on TV. And that was really striking to me because I think of, because I don't know that much about documentary filmmaking in China, but my impression would be that the documentaries that would have been on TV when you were a kid would have been very state-sanctioned documentaries. I wonder if you had strong memories of watching documentaries as a young person.
Yeah, I'll have to say I think documentaries, especially documentary films, is not something that I'm familiar with, especially independent documentary film. Is not something I'm familiar with growing up at all. But as I mentioned, in 1993, that's a very significant year for Shanghai because that's when that Shanghai started to open up as part of the economic growth, and we established our first subway line. And all of a sudden, people from the countryside, rural areas, flooded into the city to look for work because there's more opportunities, and then the system allowed that to happen. And I remember going onto the subway and smelling the smell from the countryside of the taste of mud, that what everybody is calling about. And I remember me as a Shanghainese feeling the same as the other Shanghainese and not feeling anything wrong with it. I was young, was very young, but it was until this documentary came to surface. And I have to say that that's, I think, at the time, that there is a lot of freedom in terms of exploring new forms of documentaries, and Shanghai television is at the forefront of that. So they started this verite-style documentary even in the 90s, and I thought it was really so refreshing for me as a young viewer. And they made a film about this lawsuit among this woman from the countryside who had an illegitimate child with a Shanghainese who denied the child, and also the wife, the partner. And so they filed a lawsuit, and through DNA prove that this is his child, and then he has to take them in, and they actually build a family. And I remember watching that documentary and feeling so ashamed of myself, of the sense of the taste of mud that I remember, of feeling the kind of supreme identity of myself, and knowing that there's something wrong there. And I think that was from that point on, I understand the importance of challenging our own perceptions, challenging our own assumptions, and challenging our own stereotypes. And that's what keeps us, humble. That's what kept us open to other cultures. And I think that's my anchor point as a filmmaker or as a storyteller. And I remember that the impact of that story on me, and what drove me to be a journalist, and also went to Berkeley to study journalism and documentary. And the first short film I made is called Changing the Taste of Mud. And the film is actually about this low-level bureaucrat, because of the difference of class and identity between people from the rural areas and the urban areas in China. This low-level bureaucrat realized the gap and the discrimination. So he turned this piece of wasteland into a city, and invited all the people from the rural areas to build a city of themselves, and ironically stamped their residential card from peasants to citizens. And they truly built a city out of themselves. So the film is called Changing the Taste of Mud. And I wanted to, make this film as my first film to honor the importance of me challenging my own perception and stereotypes. And then that becomes like the thing that I hold dear to myself, every film that I make in the past 20 years.
So when you went to Berkeley to study journalism and film, what were you, did you feel like you needed to come to the West to get that education?
I did, because I think the journalism training in China and then in the West is very different. I also just, growing up in Shanghai, which is a city that's very much influenced by Western countries and by other cultures, I always long to, expand my horizons and all of that. And also like knowing what the rest of the world is and how people live differently, and how can that challenge my own perceptions, assumptions. So, all of that, I think, drove me to journalism, drove me to coming to the US, and drove me to go back to China and continue to make films. And I remember that, after I made the first film, Nanking, as a co-producer in the US, and that film did really well. I had a high visibilities and all of that, but I realized that my fellow Chinese filmmakers would never have the same resources to get the film this far. So how could I help them? And I also understand the perspective that they provide are also really critical before all the talks about equality, inclusion, and industry and whatsoever. So that was also the reason that it drove me to go back to China and made a commitment to produce films for only first-time female Chinese filmmakers.
And I've heard you talk about attention that you see for Chinese filmmakers who come to the West looking for funding because there are more sources for independent film funding in the West. But by trying to cater to the tastes of Western funders, sometimes that filmmaking you've described, causes those films to be tailored for a Western audience as opposed to a Chinese audience. Can you talk about the tensions that you see there?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason, because we have no market, we have no resources. So there are a few pitch forums that's only accessible to, the Chinese filmmakers has accessibilities to, and those are probably the only resources that they can access to. And these pitch forums were attended a lot of times by Western commission editors, who sometimes were, providing suggestions to filmmakers of, in order for you to get funding, this is a film I'm looking for, things like that. I think it's changing to become much better, but still that, especially a lot of filmmakers, I think that we don't even have much of an industry in China. And so there is this vast difference from, there's a lot of first-time filmmakers, and then there's only a very few established filmmakers, and there's nothing in between. And so it's really hard for the first-time filmmakers to navigate how to take these opinions without losing their voices. So I think that it's so hard for Chinese filmmakers to find their own voices. Part of it is because of our education. It's not very much kind of individual voice nurturing kind of setting. So it's people are hard to know like what can say or what is right to say, on itself, while when the resources are all from elsewhere, it just makes it even harder for them to navigate for themselves. So I think that in that kind of space, when I work with filmmakers, a lot of my work is to helping them to find their own voice. And that becomes the crucial kind of learning curve and the crucial kind of role of me as a producer. And I didn't realize that along that way, I also found my own voice. And that's why when I took over Hidden Letters, I was very nervous to direct as the first time, but then I was really embracing of looking back of what I gained from producing and using that as my anchor to embrace my own voice. And I knew that, the more time I spent with Hidden Letters, the more I was very clear that I do have one.
I want to thank Violet Du Feng for speaking with me. Hidden Letters is now available on video on demand. I'm entering 2023 with a New Year's resolution to bring you more episodes more frequently. On Instagram this month, we're turning over the Pure Nonfiction feed to several filmmakers for them to share a day of their visual diary. I hope you'll follow their posts and share them. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.